The art of communication is the language of leadership. James Hume said that once. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Moving Forward Leadership Podcast, episode number 10, The Missing Aspect Which Leads All Leaders to Failures. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. It is Scott McCarthy, your host and founder of the Moving Forward Leadership Podcast. And if this is your first time listening in on the podcast, I'd like to welcome you. And if this is your dozenth time or your 20th time listening to the podcast, welcome back again. Have a great new show lined up for you, which I think you will love. Actually, I know you'll love because I love this whole concept and topic. Just a few updates on what's going on. Recently back from a beautiful trip to Mexico with my wife and young son. We had an awesome time down in the Grand Palladium. I would definitely recommend that resort to anybody who likes to get out and go down to those all-inclusive resorts for a vacation. You'll notice that on the Facebook page there, I posted a video, so have a look at that if you haven't already, and feel free to leave me your comments and thoughts. Few changes recently to the Moving Forward Leadership Podcast I want to highlight before we kick into the topic. If you listened to episode 9, the last episode there, you would have heard some new music both at the intro and as well new music throughout the podcast. So hopefully you like that. So these are just a few of the changes in the back that I'm working on to make this podcast the best podcast out there for you, both aesthetically as well as content-wise. These changes came on board because I am now a part of a group. Endpoint Media is a site which is now producing this podcast, so I've been picked up by them, and it's a great help. A lot of resources in there which they're helping me with in areas which I don't have expertise. So feel free to swing by endpointmedia.co. All right, and there's a load of different podcasts, different blogs, which are a part of Endpoint Media, and you can definitely listen in or have a read at the various media that is part of that group of different media services, I'll call it. Finally, the website, I've been working on the website. There's been a few changes and updates on the website. One thing which I definitely would like to highlight is a best book section. So I do a lot of reading on various topics, especially in leadership. So I currently have 4 books there, which you should go ahead and if you haven't read yet, definitely have a read of them, okay? Where can you find that? Of course, go to movingforwardleadership.com and you'll see it at the top of the webpage. As well, I'll have a link to the best books page in the show notes, and you can find them at movingforwardleadership.com or through your various podcast app. So I just wanted to talk about a topic today which is near and dear to my heart, and that is the missing aspect which leads all leaders to failure, okay? And the reason why I want to talk about that is because there's a lot of talk right now about vision, and Simon Sinek is really doing a big push on why and so on and so forth. But there's this one key aspect which I find is very common, especially with new leaders, that they forget about and they fail at, and that is communication. So I'm going to take you down a story of one organization which I saw this in very deeply, a disconnect between the leader and the followers of that organization, and that was due to communication. I'll tell you what happened. All right, so feel free to sit back, pop some popcorn, and have a good listen. So this is a story of an organization run by a gentleman by Dan. So Dan reached out to me when I was doing some consulting work, and he asked me to come in and basically have a look at his organization and do some team building for his members. there's been some issues. So the background on Dan's organization was that it was a relatively new organization within his industry and in his very small niched area. Okay, they broke into the market pretty well. Dan had a really great vision of what he wanted his organization to do, and the team was outstanding. I'll go into more of the team later, but they broke into the moral of the story is they broke into the market very well, and they established themselves as a competitor for some of the top-notch some of the top-notch players out there within their area. However, about 24 months into launch of this business, Dan noticed that productivity started to drop. And when productivity drops, then profits drop and revenues drop and so on and so forth. He wondered why. So this is one of the reasons why he felt that his team wasn't really pulling their weight anymore. But he couldn't go ahead and just fire everybody, right? Good help is hard to find, and he knew he had a good team, so he needed to figure out why this was happening. So I knew Dan through some connections, and Dan reached out to me and asked me to come in and have a chat with his team members and try to develop some team building and so on and so forth in an effort that he hoped would in turn get their productivity back up to speed. So that's what I did. He brought me in and he sat me down and he explained basically everything I just explained to you, but in much greater, finer detail. I won't get into those type of details. In fact, Dan is a made-up name, and everything that you will hear is basically kind of twisted so that you can't actually tell which organization I'm talking about because we have an NDA between each other. Anyway, that being said, so Dan brought me in. He explained it all to me. He explained the situation. And then I said, all right, cool. And I went out and introduced myself to his team and started talking with his team. Before I went out, though, Dan took some time to explain his vision for his business. And I thought it was great. He really did have a good vision. When I got to his team and I started talking to them, I quickly realized his team was excellent. He had some really good people who were independently different at their at various jobs. So everybody was a specialist basically in a different area and good at what their area is, from web/application design to sales to HR to marketing. He had a small team which actually performed their independent tasks flawlessly. These guys were like top notch. I was quite surprised at the level of players that Dan had in his team there. The problem, which I quickly realized, wasn't with the team themselves at all. Not even close. No, it was actually with Dan. Dan was actually the problem. So here in case is the problem. Dan wasn't communicating with the rest of his team. So his team were acting in their own best interests on behalf of the organization, but doing things independently and not succinctly. And as well, each person was doing it within their own vision for the company and organization, not within Dan's, because no one had a clue what Dan's vision was. Dan had set up his vision so tightly that he didn't actually tell anybody. Now, to complicate the issue even further, as I talked to these people, was that they knew there was changes coming. Dan hinted that he would be making some significant changes to the company organization and their way forward, and didn't really include any of his people in these discussions. So they were just sitting there waiting for a new way forward without any input into what that new way forward should be. Granted, Dan doesn't have to include them completely into his decision-making process or his vision development. However, when you have such a solid team of high performer people, you may want to consider that, because these people will have viewpoints different than your own. But Dan didn't do that. So this was actually a shock to even me, because I had talked to Dan, and Dan didn't even mention it to me that he was basically doing this overhaul shift in the organization, because their productivity and their production had dropped so drastically. So I went and approached Dan on this, and I said, Dan, and I asked him, I'm like, do you plan on having a significant change? And he told me yes, he was planning all this stuff. And I asked him, like, well, why didn't you mention it to me? But let's table that for a second. Why haven't you actually mentioned that to your team, Dan? And Dan's explanation was pretty simple. And again, being a relatively new leader, it was not unexpected. And Dan's idea was this. He wanted to have the perfect vision and everything set up for it, so that he could basically just present it to his people, and then from there they could run with it as much as possible. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing. However, when this is a multiple month process in which Dan has been going through this, then he may have wanted to reconsider. You might want to bring your people in from nearly the get-go, okay? That was basically my conversation with Dan. So fast forward a few weeks from there, after having some discussions with Dan and my findings and so forth, he started including his people into his thoughts and his vision and the vision development. And lo and behold, a number of his people came forward with their own ideas, which actually worked right into his vision and what he had planned. When I had asked Dan why he hadn't actually brought his people in on it right away, he told me that he wanted the 100% solution before he went forward. Well, the lesson Dan had to learn was that there is no 100% solution. And if you're going to wait and work for that 100% solution, well, you're going to fail, because your competition is going to get past you before you've developed it. And by the time you got that 100% solution developed, the situation will change. Technology will change, competitors will change, something will change, which will revert your vision obsolete and then set you back to the beginning of the process again. So the moral of the story is, don't wait for the vision to be 100% before pushing it out to your people. Bring them in early. So when I talked to Dan weeks later and the team, things had actually greatly improved. He had pushed out what he had developed for the vision so far, and now the people had a sense of the idea of where the organization was going and how they were going to get there. Productivity and of course the revenues and profits went along with that, and it went up. So it's important, ladies and gentlemen, when you're having a vision, that you bring your people in. So in the end, Dan's organization, it survived. No one lost their jobs, thankfully, and they continue today actually to be a pretty thriving and successful organization within their little area of expertise that they're working in on. Very happy to see that turnaround within that organization, and more importantly, Dan himself. He like I said, he was a new leader with a great team, a team which had individually a lot of experience, but he just didn't know how to grapple that experience and use it for its most benefit. So if you find yourself having issues of this type of nature, i.e. you're working on a vision, however you can't get it to the finish point where you are ready to push it out to your people, i.e. it's not at 100% or 90% complete, whatever that level is that you want it to get to, or you're having communications issues with your people, then you might want to consider a few things. And that is, ensure you have consistent and open dialogue with your people. okay? I can't say it enough that communication is the critical point of any organization. Organizations rise and falls on leadership, and as you heard from the quote at the beginning, the art of communication is the language of leadership. So these things go hand in hand, ladies and gentlemen. As well, find ways to reach out to your people, both individually and as well as a group, okay? Whatever works for you. Staff meetings for group time, as well maybe heading out for team lunches or breakfasts. I know I do that personally on a pretty regular basis. I need to get one actually going again soon because I haven't had one for a while. But it is a great way for people just to sit around in a different environment and discuss various issues at work, or not talk work at all if you're trying to just develop relationships. On the individual front, don't be shy of just walking around and talking to people and see how things are going, or just bringing people into the office and having a bit more of a formal talk. I don't mean a sit down disciplinary type talk or anything like that, but just bring them in and have a chat with them to see how things are going within them as an individual or the department or the organization as a whole. And then finally, a few other ways to increase communication, especially if you're trying to push out your vision. The new way of doing things with blogs and emails and stuff like that is you can't not leverage that, okay? So get out there, use these tools that are there. I personally have a blog for my work site as well. I don't shy with the emails in the sense of providing my people with direction and guidance, and as well my vision for our organization. So I hope that helps, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed the story there with Dan and his organization and that critical aspect that Dan was failing at, which basically was leading to the failure of his organization, and that is communication. So that wraps up today's episode. Again, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any thoughts, comments, questions, feel free to reach out to me via a number of different ways. You can follow me on Twitter at MFL_podcast. Again, that is at MFL as in Moving Forward Leadership _podcast. You can go to the Facebook group, the Facebook page, and feel free to shoot me a message or leave a post there. Just search Moving Forward Leadership on Facebook or facebook.com/Moving Forward Leadership. And finally, go ahead and go to the website at movingforwardleadership.com and feel free to drop me an email through there. As well, we have a monthly newsletter which goes out at the beginning of the month, where I go ahead and talk about the previous month's podcasts, any posts I've done up, as well any interesting leadership reads I've had throughout the month. And finally, I'm always looking for your reviews on either iTunes or Google Play. So please, if you do enjoy this podcast and what I have to say, feel free to go out there and leave me. And of course, where do you listen? You can feel free to listen to this podcast at Shout Engine, Google Play Music, iTunes, or through your podcast app. That is all for now. Wish you all the best in your day and week, and we'll be in touch again soon. Take care now, ladies and gentlemen.